Welcome everyone to today's Light Reading webinar, Carrier Ethernet Wholesale Services and Interconnection Trends. I'm Stan Hubbard, the host of the webinar, which is brought to you by the MEF, Megapath, Telex, Fujitsu Heavy Reading, and Light Reading. As for the format, we will spend about 40 minutes running through the content and then open things up for questions and answers with the audience. Please submit your questions throughout the webinar so that we can have a chance to look over them as we move into the Q&A period. Just type your question into the Ask a Question text area below the video window and then click the Submit button. At this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. This webcast contains audience polling. The poll question will appear in the slide presentation window. Please complete the poll when it appears and click on the Submit Answer button located on the polling slide window. Thank you. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides by clicking on the slide download button located below the presentation window. If you experience any technical problems, please contact the support team by clicking on the link below the media player. I'm pleased to be joined today by several industry experts whose companies are playing important roles in shaping the development of the Ethernet wholesale market. We have Tadashi Yagami, Vice President of Wholesale Marketing for Megapath Wholesale, Les Williams, Director of Ethernet Exchange Services for Telex, and Ralph Santatoro, Director of Carrier Ethernet Market Development from Fujitsu. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good day, Stan.
All three of their companies are participating in the Ethernet Expo Americas that is being held in New York City during the 8th and 9th of November. Our goal in this webinar is to discuss important wholesale services trends and spotlight the role that the MEF is playing in helping drive the development and growth of the market. Ralph will start us out with an update on recent MEF activity and will highlight key wholesale and other Carrier Ethernet related initiatives. Next, I will share some data points on the market opportunity for wholesale services and why this is such an important focus for the MEF, light reading, and heavy reading. I'll then hand things over to Les, who will provide his perspective on the evolution of the wholesale business model and discuss new options for extending service reach. Ralph will discuss the MEF's work on a new Ethernet access service type. Then Tadashi will give a wholesale perspective on meeting provider needs and share his thoughts on the positive impact that the Ethernet access type should have on the market. Les will discuss interconnection options currently available in the market and describe how interconnected Carrier Ethernet networks can enable standardized, streamlined delivery of MEF certified services over multiple networks. Then Ralph will close us out with a portion of the webinar by providing an update on the recent MEF work related to the all-important OAM issue. Then we'll move on to Q&A with the audience. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Ralph. Ralph?
Thank you, Stan. So as many are familiar with the Metro Ethernet Forum, the premier organization for developing Carrier Ethernet standards for Ethernet networks and services, we've just celebrated our 10th anniversary this year. And it was interesting to see that in 2001, when we formed the organization, how Ethernet, as at the time, was really a best effort technology and not really able to deliver mass market services. So it's kind of interesting to step back and see the past 10 years and what's happened in the industry, where Carrier Ethernet today is the highest growth type of service for wide area connectivity. The MEF focuses on three functional areas. We have three committees: the technical committee, which focuses on developing the technical specifications and implementation agreements and test specifications; the marketing committee, which basically educates the market on not only the MEF technical specifications, but also Carrier Ethernet in general, in order to create awareness and show new applications for the Carrier Ethernet. And then finally, in the area of compliance, our certification committee, we have three different types of certifications: services certification for Ethernet services, we have equipment certification, and finally professional certification for industry professionals, which we launched earlier this year. As you can see, we have 186 members as of today, and there's going to be a number more added this year. But the key takeaway here is that the MEF is a global organization, and we have service providers in all the major markets around the world that are either have their services certified or our members and our members of the MEF at the same time. Next slide, please. So if you take sort of a journey through the last 10 years, in the beginning of the Metro Ethernet Forum, we were developing, basically trying to get standardized a set of specifications to define Ethernet services. Many, many different service offerings were available, each slightly different, in some cases quite different. And so the first couple of years of the MEF, we were focusing on how do we standardize the interfaces, namely the user-to-network interface, as well as Ethernet services. The second phase of carrier Ethernet was really now how do we assure that those services that we standardized meet some form of compliance, and that's when we developed the carrier Ethernet services and equipment certifications to basically certify for those services that we defined earlier. And then the next phase that we've worked on over the last couple of years is on interconnect. So how do we build these Ethernet services to go beyond the metro and be global? And one of the key specifications there is the ENNI, the Ethernet External Network-to-Network Interface, defined in MEF 26. And as part of our global interconnect program, how do you standardize that and connect multiple carriers together to deliver an end-to-end service with high quality of service? And you'll hear our speakers later today talk about how they're rolling out services, and ENNI plays a very key role in that. Next slide. So some of the latest projects in the MEF are, there's a new technical specification which will be going to final member vote shortly, which defines Ethernet access services, or e-access services, specifically targeting the wholesale access marketplace. And this is one of the key topics of this webinar today. This is delivering a wholesale access service for an Ethernet service provider to be able to reach off-net or out-of-franchise types of customer locations through an Ethernet access provider. One of the second large projects we have going on now is actually using carrier Ethernet as a methodology to access cloud providers. So using carrier Ethernet networks to deliver private cloud services, unlike using the public internet today, which is used for public cloud services. The other key area is our new professional certification program that we launched earlier this year. In addition to our first certification called the Carrier Ethernet Certified Professional, or CECP, which is an exam that the student would take, and when they pass that exam, they are CECP certified. The MEF has developed an app for the iPad or iPhone called MEF on the Go, which has the study guide including all the MEF specifications and other information to allow students to quickly prepare for the test. And then finally, the last area, mobile backhaul, or carrier Ethernet for mobile backhaul, is quite a large area given the importance of that in the industry, one of the fastest growing or highest growth rate types of services, especially in the wholesale area. And the MEF has focused on implementation agreements on carrier Ethernet for mobile backhaul. Next slide.
Thank you, Ralph. Appreciate that. Available information suggests the global Ethernet market has held up relatively well despite macroeconomic challenges. We continue to hear reports from service providers that suggest the market for Ethernet services sold to enterprises is growing at a double-digit rate year over year. This retail growth is fueling the solid demand for wholesale Ethernet services. But in addition to that, mobile backhaul, which Ralph touched on in the previous slide, has emerged as a very important driver for the wholesale market over the past couple of years. And that's translated into good business for the Ethernet over fiber access platform players. This graphic, drawn from a heavy reading report, illustrates revenue growth expectations for different bandwidth rates. At the lower end of the bandwidth spectrum, Megapath and others are taking advantage of technologies like Ethernet over bonded copper pair platforms to shift customers away from those traditional T1s and E1s to mid-band Ethernet services. And at the higher end, we continue to see insatiable demand for reliable, low-cost bandwidth from financial, media, health, and other industry verticals that are driving demand for 1 gig and 10 gig Ethernet access. Finally, I should note that service provider members of the MEF expect wholesale market activity to pick up significantly going forward. 93% of members who participated in a wholesale access survey said they expect their companies to buy more wholesale access services. And 86% said they believe it is important to track delay variation, and loss metrics using service OEM tools. So with that, I'd like to move on now and have an audience poll. And the first and the poll question here is, what do you believe is the biggest challenge in introducing or selling Ethernet services? Is it availability, meaning the lack of footprint, qualifying the process for the service, installation turnaround, quality of service, not enough service features, or perhaps non-standard interconnects? We'll take a second now and wait for the poll results to flow in. But would anybody speaking on the webinar here like to make a comment at this point? Maybe about what you've heard as some of the biggest obstacles in selling Ethernet services.
Yeah, it's Stan, it's Tadashi. It's interesting seeing kind of the live results as they come up because it does seem to be, in the past, when we've seen responses to similar types of questions, it was all about availability and the lack of footprint, and that's not surprising given that this is just such a new solution and hasn't hit the marketplace. But it does seem like some of the other areas are now gaining importance, and that's probably because Ethernet's becoming that much more available, so the availability becomes obviously still an ongoing issue, but less of that, and then it becomes more about what's it like to work with the solution itself, what it looks like.
Yeah, we'll take a couple more seconds here to wait for a few more results to come in, but any of the other speakers want to comment?
Hi, Stan, it's Les. Again, it's interesting to see the dynamics of the polling here. And another thing I noticed is the quality of service. I see that has a very high percentage, followed by non-standard interconnect. And coming from a carrier-neutral multi-tenant data center perspective, you could see how that factors in, because that's been one of the challenges that MEF has tried to address in terms of the Ethernet access types that we'll be talking about later on, and how we try to standardize that. It still remains a bit of a challenge, so it just maps correctly with what the market is saying with this poll.
Okay. So I've gone ahead and shared the results here, and you know, in the past, when we've asked enterprise end users what their biggest concern has been, it has been availability, and that's really ranked at the top, and it still continues to stay ahead of the others. But it is interesting that you've got almost 20% saying non-standard interconnects and quality of service are two big issues. Ralph, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think in terms of availability, if you look at the Tier 1 providers, I mean, today, you know, they've spent the last many years building these one-off agreements, so they're probably in pretty good shape. But once you get beyond the Tier 1s, you know, who have the resources to do that, other service providers that do have either regional or global connectivity are still, you know, availability and non-standard interconnects. It makes sense that those would be very important. And so the MEF specification, the EN&I specification in MEF 26 has only been out for maybe a year and a half. And so it takes several years before a service can be retooled to support that. So I suspect if we do this poll a year from now, we'll see non-standard interconnects become a much smaller percentage. And hopefully because of that and through the use of the standard interconnects as well as Ethernet exchanges, we'll see availability, that number reduced down as well.
You know, one thing I'm kind of surprised by is the installation turnaround. I had a conversation just last week with a couple of different conversations with different major operators talking about the time it takes to get an Ethernet access service up and running, and we're seeing some significant delays there on in some cases. So I'm kind of interested to see what else we'll hear in the future on this. All right, let's go ahead and move on and hand it over to Les. Les, you want to take us through the business model?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. Well, what we've seen in the business model for wholesale access with carrier Ethernet is that before 2010, when the MEF 26 EN&A standard was defined, was that Ethernet was picking up quite rapidly. And as your numbers show from the previous slide, we are well on track and doing very well in the carrier Ethernet space. And as the poll shows just now, availability has always been an issue or lack of footprint for carriers. Wherein the Tier 1 carriers had been able to leverage their bilateral agreements, global connectivity still remained a problem. So carrier Ethernet became ubiquitous. People were using it for much more than just carrier Ethernet connectivity. The challenge then became off-net connectivity. How do you connect both locally, nationally, regionally, or at a global scale? This was done on a case-by-case basis based on, for the providers. The local carriers, the regional players were left out of it for the most part. So it became more centralized around Tier 1 type providers who leveraged their bilateral arrangements. And this was done using direct ENNI. In 2010, around about then, MEF introduced the ENNI standard, which was MEF 26, that defined how carriers should connect one to the other, and that further accelerated the growth of carrier Ethernet from between autonomous systems. So we see an accelerated growth of interconnected autonomous carrier Ethernet networks, and there was a standardized, streamlined delivery of carrier Ethernet services over multiple provider networks. We also saw the emergence of the Ethernet exchange providers, which provided a profitable and efficient, scalable model for carriers to interconnect and bypass some of the extra steps that come with disparate networks and prolong the provisioning process. Carrier Ethernet services then was being able to deliver on an end-to-end basis. End users connected at off-net locations were able to be supported by carriers, and the service attributes and SLAs were kept the same. In any case, there still was a limitation at the time in that the SLAs were mostly limited to the network service part of it, which was the ENNI to ENNI and the points between the carrier networks in the wide area network. When you step outside of that, the ENNI to the UNI had remained hugely disparate and mostly undefined. So that remained a problem going into 2010. Next slide, please. In 2010, following the definition of MEF 26, as well as the emergence of the exchanges, we saw a lot of refining and a lot of cleanup within that space, and carriers were able to connect, and wholesale services were done at the wide area globally, locally, nationally, etc. What remained the problem was with the access piece. There was many different ways that people were interconnecting. There were many different mechanisms for that. What the MEF has done is go on to define the e-access service type, which is a standard certified ENNI to unique carrier Ethernet delivery mechanism. What this does is that it establishes an industry standard for deploying, buying, and selling of Ethernet access services. It now enables providers to deliver a true end-to-end service experience, class of service, management, and protection. It also helps for the retail Ethernet provider to be able to offer seamless end-to-end SLA. That means all the way to the customer prem. Ethernet exchanges taking a critical role for efficient aggregation of this wholesale access also helps facilitate this, particularly in terms of doing the translation between disparate network systems. Next slide. Today what we are seeing for the most part is what I refer to as the dynamic wholesale market. This is now when we have service providers connecting to communication service providers or the non-traditional Ethernet network provider. We have the carrier Ethernet exchanges, which are playing the lead broker in facilitating these services today. So again, in terms of the fact that there are many different standards for connecting, following the MEF 26 and the Ethernet access standard, the exchanges take that lead role in brokering this facilitation within this dynamic space. The business model is still shaping up, for instance, with private and hybrid cloud demand. In the opening parts of the presentation today, Ralph alluded to the fact that the MEF is working on carrier Ethernet as Ethernet cloud carrier, because we are seeing more and more of that happening now when the cloud providers are becoming a buyer of wholesale Ethernet services as well, and they're looking for specialized characteristics within those Ethernet type services that they buy. It is a large wholesale opportunity for e-access providers, and the MEF is actively working on that. If you look at the diagram below, what is different on here is now you have the buyer's platform network is that of the cloud provider or the communication service provider. So we've moved from where it was made primarily service providers to service provider within the tier 1 space, wide area network, then to incorporating the local footprint and looking at the ENNI to the UNI, which we are addressing with the e-access service type. And we see a new opportunity within the wholesale space in the dynamic wholesale market, which means carriers will now have to interact directly with some of these communication service providers or cloud providers in delivering wholesale Ethernet access services as an enabler to these platforms. So that's the next phase that we would see coming up shortly. With that, Stan, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Les. I'm glad you emphasized the cloud angle here, because it certainly is a trend we've noticed over the last 9 to 12 months especially. So, Ralph, you want to take us through the Ethernet access type?
Sure. So what I'd like to do now is I'll take you through the new definition for e-access services out of the MEF, and then I'll walk through a couple of use cases on how this new service type is used. So sort of in summary, the MEF retail services that have been defined a number of years ago are uni-to-uni services. So these are the retail service offerings, and we say uni-to-uni, so the handoff at the customer premises is a user-to-network interface. And so the three service types the MEF has defined are E-line, which is for all types of point-to-point services, E-LAN, which is multi-point to multi-point services, and E-tree, which is routed multi-point, more for a broadcast or type of network if you're broadcasting video, for example, or even internet access. And so those are the retail services, which are uni-to-uni. Now the new service that the MEF has defined, and as I mentioned earlier, that specification is going for final member vote shortly, so it'll be publicly available in a couple of months. That new service is called the e-access type, or Ethernet access service type, and that service focuses on wholesale or carrier-to-carrier types of services, and it's between a UNI, or user-to-network interface, and an ENNI, or external network-to-network interface. So it's a carrier handoff at the ENNI, and it provides connecting the end-user location at the UNI to a carrier. As in the diagram here, it could be to an Ethernet or IP service provider, or as Les mentioned earlier, it actually could even be to a cloud service provider. So this new carrier-to-carrier handoff type of service under the name e-access is our wholesale offering that we're first defining, and we have two definitions under that. One is Access EPL, or Access Ethernet Private Line, and the second one is Access Ethernet Virtual Private Line. Those are the first two of the e-access service types, and as we go to different phases of the project, those first two are point-to-point services, and the next phase of the project will do multi-point services. Next slide. So this e-access service is really the industry-first type of definition to standardize that sort of first last-mile Ethernet access connections. And as I mentioned earlier, it defines UNI to ENNI Ethernet access services, and then there will be MEF certification around this as well, just like we have certification, MEF 9 and 14 certification today for the E-line and E-LAN service types. The fundamental difference between the two e-access services defined today, the Access EPL is a port-based service, which means it's a single service at the UNI, just like EPL is today on the retail side. And then the Access EVPL is a VLAN-aware service that allows service multiplexing at the UNI, so you can offer multiple Ethernet services at that same UNI physical port. And as you can see in the diagram here, the access provider delivers the e-access service and then hands that off either to an Ethernet exchange or an Ethernet or IP service provider or even a cloud service provider that would then connect the remainder of the Ethernet virtual connection between uni to uni.
Yep, so I would just
Next slide, please.
send a note to Anna and say, what's up with that?
So what I'd like to go through now is a couple of use cases to put this in perspective. So the first use case will cover internet access, an internet service provider wanting to deliver internet service to a subscriber and peering with an Ethernet access provider. So this is very analogous today to, if you can imagine, an internet service provider wanting to purchase in the U.S., for example, a T1 access service. They want to offer a dedicated internet access service. But instead of wholesaling a T1 to reach that customer, they're now going to wholesale an Ethernet service, an Ethernet access service to reach that customer. Next, please. Okay. So in this example, the internet service provider would purchase an EPL. They want to deliver an access EPL between the subscriber A site and the ENNI. And that's really to connect up the subscriber A site. And then they would purchase an Access EPL2 to connect subscriber site B to the ENNI for the ISP to deliver an internet access service to subscriber site B. Can you click on next to see if we can get the builds going here?
It's the last.
Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Okay, so just to reiterate that, so the ISP would buy an Access EPL1 in this case to interconnect subscriber sites A's uni to the ENNI. And then, next please. And then they would purchase Access EPL2 to interconnect subscriber site B. So this is very similar to an ISP in the US, for example, purchasing a Type 2 T1 access circuit to reach the different sites, but in this case, it's truly an Ethernet access service. It's Ethernet instead of a TDM circuit to reach the location. Next, please.
All right, I have it right here as well. So
and then the ISP can deliver Internet access service to these locations. Can deliver Ethernet access to the Internet access to these locations, and using this Access EPL, so you have an Internet access connection to these locations using Access EPL circuits. Next, please. One of the key attributes of delivering this over Ethernet as an access technology is that you can deliver IPv4 or IPv6 Internet connections, and the Ethernet access provider does not need to participate in or have equipment that's actually IPv4 or IPv6 aware, because it's purely layer 2 based access network. Next slide. So let's take a look at an EVPL example for connecting two off-net locations using Access EPL tail circuits. Next build. So the retail provider buys an Access EPL to reach subscriber site A. Next. And now they can continue and create the path to deliver an EVPL service between subscriber site A and subscriber site C. Next. The retail provider would then purchase a second Access EPL circuit between the ENNI and UNI at subscriber B. Next. And that would allow them to deliver a second EVPL service between subscriber site B and subscriber site C. Now take note that at subscriber site C, there are two services multiplexed there at that UNI. You have EVPL1 and EVPL2, whereas at the UNIs at subscriber site A and subscriber site B can use an Access EPL service, which is a port-based service, and no multiplexing is required at those UNIs. Next.
That's what that means. So after you make this change, it's going.
So the first example I talked about was accessing the Internet, so Ethernet access to IP services. The second example was an Ethernet Layer 2 service, and it was point-to-point. Now, one of the things I wanted to cover as well is having a multi-point service. So even though Access EPL and Access EVPL are point-to-point services, you can actually deliver a multi-point service, such as ELAN, in this case an Ethernet private LAN service, connecting two locations which are both off-net and reachable by Ethernet access provider 1 and 2. Next. So the retail service provider would purchase an Access EPL from Ethernet access provider 1 to connect them to their network. Next. And they would purchase a second Access EPL to connect subscriber site B. Now they have connectivity to the
So
both
it's actually
off-net
pretty easy
locations
to test.
to reach their network.
So it's very
Next.
easy. All you do is copy and paste it.
Since subscriber site C is on their network, they can reach them, and they build the EP-LAN service. So now you deliver a multi-point EP-LAN service using 2 Access EPLs. Next. So the unique situation here is you're using a point-to-point access service, in this case Access EPL,
It looks like
to
it's
deliver
like
a multi-point EP-LAN
example,
service.
yeah. But
Next.
It changes for everyone.
Next. So some things to consider in the wholesale Ethernet access service market is that Ethernet obviously is today the preferred technology for inter-provider handoff. A couple years back it would have been an SDH or a SONET connection. But the retail providers today would prefer a layer 2 handoff, regardless of whether it's an Ethernet service or an IP service. Next.
Area where you can put final webinar archive location.
Now, one of the interesting things about Ethernet services is it can be delivered over many different types of layer 1 networks. So you can deliver Ethernet over SONET, over bonded T1s, over OTN, over bonded dry copper pairs, for example. Now, one of the things you'd like to be able to do is, though, deliver a unified Ethernet service over these different networks, and the MEF Ethernet access service definition will allow you to achieve this.
Just copy and paste
Next.
the same link. That's it. Yeah. Yeah.
And as you saw from the previous
And make sure
examples,
there's no space
Ethernet
at the end
access
of it.
services can be used for a variety of different
So when you paste it,
access
make sure there's
services
no
for
space.
either to IP services or layer 2 services. And then there's more infrastructure services like cell site backhaul. Next.
Well, I'm saying after the URL,
Next.
it's going to be a backslash, right? So, it's gonna have a
So some of the
character
access
at the end
service
of the link.
challenges
So it's
is next,
www.ibm.com, right?
where we want to, for a retail service provider to reach their customer premises, whether it's an end user or a cell tower, for example. Next, they're going to deliver an Ethernet uni at the customer premises, and then an Ethernet ENNI is the way they're going to access their Ethernet access network over these variety of access technologies that are available by access providers.
Make sure there's
Next.
no additional spaces after that.
So the question is, how do you deliver this standardized MEF e-access service over these diverse
Put your
access
cursor
networks?
at the end of that link
Next, please.
and make sure there's
Next.
no additional spacing because that messes it up.
Next. So the way to do that is to use an EOX gateway. So an EOX gateway allows you to connect up these different diverse networks if you're running Ethernet over fiber, for example, over a 10 gig or gig protected network, or an unprotected network using an Ethernet NID, or Ethernet over bonded T1s or T3s, for example, using EOPDH, or Ethernet over bonded copper, dry copper pairs that Tadashi will talk about a little bit later, and then or over Ethernet SONET. So you have this variety of access technologies that you can deliver. Next, please.
Full screen.
And you can deliver those directly to the retail service provider using an EOX gateway, which normalizes all of those different access networks into a common Ethernet ENNI handoff. Next, please.
I don't know.
Or you can deliver those through an Ethernet exchange, which would then in turn have an ENNI to the Ethernet service provider or retail service provider. So you can deliver those either directly to the retail provider or indirectly through the Ethernet exchange. Next. And this allows you to deliver the variety of e-access services over all of these different types of access methodologies. So standard MEF e-access service, regardless of whether it's over bonded copper, fiber, Ethernet over SONET. And back to you, Stan.
You don't want
Right. Thank you, Ralph.
Okay.
Now over to
See how
Tadashi.
there's extra characters.
Thanks, Stan.
There's nothing else.
So what I'll do is just talk here about kind of our perspective on what we're seeing in the marketplace from our retail providers and partners in the market. First, when we talk about some of the challenges of rolling out a new solution or some of the areas of qualifiers, similar to what you saw in the poll question, there are a number of areas, but what we do is try to bucket them into 4 main areas. The first is what was addressed in the poll question that came out still as the number 1 area of concern for a lot of our partners, which is availability. It's a great solution, but can you provide coverage? Interestingly enough, when we polled that, a year ago, the numbers were much higher than the 41% we see today. Again, it just seems like now that the market is more mature, the other areas come into more focus as we go forward. So the other areas being cost efficiency. So we know that ongoing cost efficiency of this Ethernet services is the attraction, but you also need to consider the upfront cost of getting the service up and running and connected with your network. Then there's the technology itself behind the different service providers. You know, what's the equipment selection, what options are available, you know, are the key standards, you know, like MEF 26 specifications acknowledged within the build-out. And again, as the poll's questions sort of showed us, you know, it's non-standard interconnects, quality of service do remain areas of concern from our retail provider community. And then lastly, you know, beyond the technology in terms of the solution setup, it's the ongoing operational excellence. Can you provide the same quality and the standards for the retail customers from a customer experience to keep not only the operational costs down as a provider, but also to avoid losing customers that they've worked so hard to, you know, to gain. So in the past, you know, again, availability has been the standout need, but clearly operational excellence has become more important to the retail provider community now that there's a greater appreciation of what it takes to successfully launch Ethernet service.
No, because
next slide, please.
Susan and Heather recently just said that we should do it.
So, you know, what type of solution can be offered? You know, recognizing that transition can't happen overnight, you know, we hope that you can see that Megapath is an example of how a wholesale provider making an integrated transition to Ethernet. And what I mean by that is that demand still exists for alternative services like the ATM legacy services, but we also recognize the demand for those new Ethernet services. And to that end, we've developed a network in the following manner. You know, one, there's support for both the Ethernet and legacy services, acknowledge that technology needs, but in a manner to acknowledge operational cost efficiencies. And what that means is that rather than you know, throw away the existing services that we know that the existing demand is still prevalent, it's building out the Ethernet network to support the new services like Ethernet over copper. But there's also a need to tie the new portfolio of the Ethernet services back to the existing legacy services. And so from that perspective, you know, in our case, we've got an inner working gateway to sort of tie the entire portfolio together from a wholesale partner perspective to eliminate the need for multiple backhaul types with a given partner. And what that does is, again, it goes to the earlier need to reduce the overall cost of working with a particular wholesale service provider, and so it addresses the upfront as well as the ongoing costs. And then again, the ongoing costs are going to be supported by operational capabilities and processes. So that's what the poll question led to, which is what does the qualifying process look like, what is the installation experience, and so you want to look for a wholesale service provider that has the fundamental capabilities regardless of the technology that is being offered through them. The other thing to notice here in our architecture is that we recognize that there's still, you know, a disparate set of needs out there, and so recognizing multiple handoff options to acknowledge different carrier goals and network needs. So whether it's an ENNI to facilitate that direct connection or through an exchange, and those are the types of flexibilities that are being built in that we see needed going forward. And so in Megapath's case, again, so there's ENNIs that acknowledge the key standards, but also different options through the exchanges. And so Megapath is today connected to a number of exchanges, including Telex and Phoenix, for Ethernet over copper services to provide more of those options. So again, Megapath Wholesale we hope you see as an example of how to meet market demands in a comprehensive manner both today and tomorrow.
I think we need to
Stan, next slide, please.
That's easy. That's
and so
something that
I think you can see the best evidence for our excitement towards this new market area through the rollout that we have today. As announced earlier this year, we've committed to a national rollout of Ethernet over copper services. And again, one of the reasons driving this is beyond the market demand that we see out there for the initial deployment that we had in LA is to address one of the biggest challenges that we keep hearing from our wholesale partners, which is availability. So acknowledging market demand, the Ethernet over copper service will be available to a number of key markets across the country, starting with an additional 14 markets in 2011, and that's the build-out that we're completing today, to access markets like New York, Washington, San Francisco, San Diego, Chicago, and Miami across the country. And we're doing so in a way to meet the market need for granularity in options. And so the Ethernet over copper service that we're rolling out is available at a number of different speeds, from 2.0 to 20.0. And again, that's to provide granularity and better meet the retail customer needs.
Yeah, that's better.
It's also going to be offered with multiple Ethernet class service packages to best suit different retail provider solution needs. So mapping the types of traffic to the network performance and the prioritization schemes that you ask of your partners in these solutions. And these are all going to be backed by strong service level agreements. So to not only ensure cost efficiency with the compelling price points of these Ethernet services, you need to assure your retail customers the same performance that they've grown to expect with the legacy service. So from that perspective, again, you hopefully can see the importance of acknowledging key standards from a customer experience standpoint. So back to you, Stan.
Okay, thank you, Tadashi. And now over to Celeste to talk a little bit about the options for the interconnection.
Thanks, Stan. For the most part, what we see as the two predominant options for carrier Ethernet connectivity or interconnection is one, using the carrier Ethernet exchange, or the direct connect model. The direct connect model has been there, and it's the tried and true, the old way of doing it, and we see it still being leveraged for bilateral ENI between two carrier Ethernet service providers. While the Ethernet exchange is a more scalable point of interconnection among service providers where carrier Ethernet services are exchanged. With the bilateral model, we notice that, again, if I were to invoke the slide that Stan had at the start of it, it showed the bandwidth progression, and it showed the bandwidth between 100 meg and between 100 meg to 10 meg services as the most deployed at 48.2%. And within the exchange space, we see a lot of that because that's where the scalable type of connectivity factors in. When it gets really large and greater than that, when we begin to look into the gig, we see about 29.8% of the uptake going to 2014, and that for the most part has been leveraged by huge communication service providers and also by tier 1 providers who can leverage their bilateral arrangement. So the mid-tier or the local carriers and other providers looking to expand their footprint and do so quickly in a very scalable manner, we see falling within that 100 meg to 10 meg, and now actually we're beginning to see quite an uptick at the gig level, and these are being done via the Ethernet exchanges. So you have the traditional direct connect, which again big bilateral ENNIs, and you have the more scalable carrier Ethernet exchange model as well. With that, also what we've seen from a Talec's perspective is that most carriers are using these two together hand in hand in a progressive model, wherein the carrier Ethernet exchange is used for expansion into new markets or quick markets, or for more localized footprints wherein the bandwidth requirements are not as large for a particular provider as they might be for going globally or with a big carrier outside of a footprint, outside of their footprint, but a strategic market for them in terms of one-stop shop. So we see people starting with the exchanges and then graduating or maturing some of their ENNI connectivity within the exchange onto direct connect. So we're seeing the two go hand in hand for the most part. Next slide, please.
Yeah, Warren is Leo's now.
Now, regardless of whether you do the direct connect or you do a carrier Ethernet exchange model, these two need to be inconsistent with the MEF standard, the 5 attributes of carrier Ethernet, which is standardized services, scalability, the quality of service, service management, and reliability. The first slide, and we spoke about the expansion and the availability. We saw that in the polls as well. And what, if we're to focus on the Ethernet exchanges, what the Ethernet exchange does with that is that it provides a readily available pool of carriers to choose from. It gives the service provider a choice. So you have carriers to choose from in terms of buying wholesale services, and it gives you a broader market to sell wholesale services as well, without going through individualized mapping and process work with all the services, because you're using a standardized platform as is. The direct ENNIs as well as the Ethernet exchange platform that goes within carrier Ethernet exchange providers platforms is done in consistent with the MEF standards, the 5 standards that I'll talk about in a second. So when you use that, again, some of the concerns that were highlighted when we did the poll, for instance, non-standard interconnect, process for the service, quality of service, a lot of these issues are alleviated when you use the exchanges, because it takes that away and it gives you a standardized platform for interconnecting in a speedy manner. Like with MegaPath, what we are beginning to see as a new path within the exchange space is that the exchanges are beginning to allow interconnectivity or interworking with legacy systems. So there is a standard form of carrier Ethernet which can provide handoff to other types of legacy systems, all while staying in compliance with the MEF standards and accelerating your time to market. If we're to look at the services, the standards that are to be met, for instance, a carrier Ethernet exchange or any form of interconnectivity that is used must support translation of the MEF, EVPL, EP-LAN service types, and profiles with multiple classes of service. It must be scalable. I just spoke about the scalability nature of it and how we address that. But in choosing a point of connectivity, you need to look at how scalable that could be. It must support and access millions of EVCs and worldwide locations with scalable processes. Your quality of service must be monitored. There must be support enforceable, measurable with end-to-end service for frame delay, delay variation, and availability. Again, when we started the call, we had alluded to the fact about the concern that people have around these parameters, these performance parameters for services. Service management. In a little bit, Ralph will be talking about OEM and how that works. Must support normalized processes for human and systems for process transactions. It must be reliable, must provide protection, carrier class with geographical diversity. And the exchanges have done a lot of investment in deploying redundant and resilient systems that provide that type of reliability at that point of interconnection, which ensures the end-to-end service level agreements that you as a wholesale provider or retail provider can guarantee to your customers. Overall, the exchanges give you a scalable model that is, again, the key of it all, and it helps you with the cost savings and revenue growth driver for development of your carrier Ethernet. With that, I would pass it back on to Stan, who would take us through it.
Thank you, Les. And I'd like to remind folks that we will be having an exchange session at the Ethernet Expo on the first day of the Expo on 8 November. So Telex will be part of that. So over to Ralph. Take us through this OEM issue. I know it's very important for the service providers right now.
Right. Thanks, Dan. So I think one of the things that the MEF has focused on here, we've defined the services and defined access services in addition to retail services. But if you look at the OEM puzzle, this is a great graphic here because it's almost like a Rubik's Cube. And it's really hard to wrap your head around the complexity of this. And so the MEF realized this and created MEF 17, which is a service OEM framework and requirements. So here are the requirements and a framework that puts all of these pieces together in a very understandable and a way where rather than seeing each of these standards in isolation, you see how they all fit together. And in fact, the MEF 30, which was recently ratified, really is an implementation agreement for service OEM fault management. So what does that mean? That allows you to troubleshoot your Ethernet service, either your Ethernet access service, your e-access service that we talked about today, or even your retail services defined by the MEF, the E-line, E-LAN, and E-tree services. And so these services use a variety of these standards. For example, the 802.1ag connectivity fault management. You've heard of the Y.1731 augmentation of that, and then for Link OEM, the 802.3AH out of IEEE. And so what it does is it puts together the framework, describes how it's used, and obviously for Ethernet services, troubleshooting a service is absolutely critical. You need to be able to troubleshoot a service rather than send people out. You want to be able to troubleshoot it remotely to actually narrow the problem down to exactly where the problem is in the network before you send somebody out in a truck to go drive out to, in some cases, perhaps a remote area for that. So in terms of the OAM, that's kind of on the fault management side, so we're defining that. We're also defining an implementation agreement for performance measurements. So the fault management, clearly a critical piece. Performance measurements allow you to take measurements such as the frame delay or frame loss ratio, for example, which are key metrics that you would use in a service level agreement. And so we're working on that now, and hopefully sometime next year that will be ratified, the performance measurements. So then you'll have the complete service OAM picture of the fault management and the performance measurements. And then finally we have the class of service. So we have a class of service implementation agreement under development that creates new classes of service for Ethernet services, but also has recommendations for different types of applications, also based on geography. So obviously class of service has implications. For example, delay is impacted based on physical distance due to speed of light. And so the implementation agreement covers all aspects of a class of service, not only the standardized markings, creating standard classes, but also providing recommendations for different applications. So to that, I'll hand it back to you, Stan, for Q&A.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ralph. We've got a few questions here already coming in. Let's take the first one. Is it appropriate to see the EN&I and E-access service type as enablers in making carrier Ethernet truly ubiquitous? Thoughts on that?
I was going to...
Yes, so Stan, this is Ralph. I'll jump in first. So when the MEF defined Ethernet services, we first started off with retail services, and that model, the E-line, E-LAN, and E-tree services, are basically working under the assumption that the service provider can reach all of their customer locations. We realized that that was not the case all the time, but that was the base. We had to start off with that as a base. And so now with the new wholesale services, the e-access services, and the EN&I, which now are for a two or more carriers to connect together, as you saw in the use cases, this actually completes the picture to really address Ethernet service ubiquity, because we know that pretty much every service provider has to peer with a wholesale access provider to reach all of their customer locations.
Okay. Next question is, are most Ethernet services delivered over fiber, and can you offer a carrier-grade Ethernet service over something other than fiber?
And just be like, this is terrible.
Tadashi, how about taking that one?
Sure. Yeah, and I think there is a lot of talk about fiber, but one of the areas that, as I've shown in my slides, we've invested in is the area of Ethernet over copper, and leveraging not only the underlying availability of copper, but also the underlying operational excellence that you need to support those kind of services. So from that standpoint, we're very excited about the prospects of providing this on a much larger scale with speeds that the market's looking for. So it's definitely going to allow for greater performance above kind of what you see from the legacy services, but at the same time allow you to sort of manage from a cost efficiency standpoint to meet the needs that you have as a retail provider, as well as meet price points for retail
as it is took me 5-10 minutes to do because
okay.
You have to pull it. If you were
here's a question related to the hybrid NID. We didn't touch on it here, but
then you would pull that.
will the Access EPL support the hybrid NID? that the MEF is working on right now?
So until we can.
Yeah, this is Ralph. I'll take that. So the MEF will actually have a webinar on the virtual NID or hybrid NID in a future webinar. So we particularly did not cover it during this session. But the answer to your question is, an Access EPL or an Access EVPL will support a hybrid NID type or virtual NID type of functionality, which is basically a functionality in the network where two service providers, the access provider and the retail provider, can access demarcation functionality that's delivered by the access provider.
Okay. And here's another question just related to how the Ethernet access is different maybe from the other service types. Can you go into a little bit more explanation as to how it compares to the traditional definitions, EPL, EVPL, the E-LAN, and the E-tree?
Sure. This is Ralph. I'll take that. Start that one. So the retail services that are defined in MEF6 are the EPL, EVPL, that fall under the E-line, and the EP-LAN, EVP-LAN, and EP-tree and EVP-tree. All of those service definitions are uni to uni, so they are connecting end user to end user typically. The new Ethernet access services are really carrier to, there's the carrier to carrier interconnect, so they all have an E and an I in them. So the first incarnations of the E-access service are the Access EPL and Access EVPL, and those are uni to E and an I services. So the big difference is that the uni is delivered to the end user, let's say the enterprise connection, and the E and an I is to connect a carrier. So there's an access provider in the case of E-access that delivers a uni on behalf of the retail provider, but then has an interconnect with the carrier via the E and an I. We're also looking at the next phase of that to define other types of E-access services that are not just point-to-point but are multi-point. So the fundamental difference, retail services are uni to uni, the E-line, E-LAN, and E-tree, and E-access are uni to E and an I.
Okay, you talked about the certification process earlier. We've got 3 different certifications going on with the MEF, and one of those is related to the services. Is there a certification program for Ethernet access type?
Yes, so there will be one coming out for the E-access types, which will cover not only the certification of the service, but will also include OAM and class of service. It'll be a very broad, encompassing certification. So stay tuned for that. We had to wait for the E-access technical specification to be completed before we can roll out the certification for that. So that will be coming. That will be forthcoming.
Okay. And then I thought this question is an interesting one. Is the MEF working on electronic ordering specifications which carriers can use to order Ethernet services from other carriers? I know that there are different, we have exchanges where you can go into basically what is a marketplace. You've got access players that have their own type of exchanges, but the MEF really hasn't played in that ordering process up to now. Are there some sort of efforts underway regarding that electronic ordering?
Yes, so this is Ralph again. So the MEF is making more focus, the focus areas are looking at more of the OAM aspects, which include, this falls under. To date, we had not worked on an ordering process per se. We had looked at this during our global interconnect project to look at how different service providers can articulate common service attributes. So if you look at the E and an I specification in MEF 26, that was the first specification to define a standard set of attributes that define the E and an I and the connection between the E and an I. And so that's sort of step one. While that does not focus specifically on an OSS system where the ordering process plays, it's the basis of how that could feed into an ordering process, so that now carriers can talk the same language when they're talking about an E and an I. So each of these attributes are technically specified in MEF 26, So over time, we expect different service providers to normalize their definitions to facilitate that ordering process.
Okay. And looks like we're just about out of time here. I wanted to give the speakers on the session a chance to kind of sum up their thoughts here. Maybe Tadashi, if you'll maybe provide maybe a comment on what you expect to see in terms of how the market is evolving, or maybe some other closing comment, and then maybe Les, and then Ralph.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many variables in terms of making newer services a success out in the marketplace, and so I think that the main message is to not forget. At the end of the day, the retail customer is looking at sort of what they experience, and so the technology is obviously going to play a key role, and the standards in terms of making sure that you're affording a certain level of quality of service, and making sure that the availability is in a manner that makes it easy to work with you as a retail provider. But the other thing to remember is the operational side of the house and some of the quote-unquote back end, which is not as sexy, but very key in terms of defining whether a customer experience is a positive one or a negative one. So all of the operational processes of installing to troubleshooting to getting visibility into your circuits, as be it from a retail provider perspective, are just as important as the technology itself.
Okay.
I think going forward, we'll see a lot of streamlining in terms of the service standards with the e-Access and the ENNI as to how things are to be done, and that would help take away some of the confusion or the headaches in terms of connectivity, and we would see a lot more speedier turn-ups and integration of services. Within our space, I think one thing to look out for is the new markets that are emerging, and wholesale providers need to get themselves geared up to address that, and how they address that in a very rapid and quick manner. Because within the exchange space, we are seeing a lot of these communication service providers use us as brokers, and the wholesale providers have that access as well, similar to the retailers. And another thing is that the SLAs, we've done it with IPVPN, and we're going to see that with carrier Ethernet as it becomes even more ubiquitous, that customers are going to want end-to-end, CE to C, customer premise to customer premise, without any type of service each. And we have to make sure everything is consistent with standard for that to happen. So watch out for that.
Okay, very good. Ralph?
Yeah, and I think, in fact, we just had our quarterly MEF meeting in Singapore last week, and just to kind of show or tie that to this webinar, we had service providers from the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, India, Malaysia, basically talking about not only the significance of the MEF standards for Ethernet services, but also this whole being able to deliver standardized services and getting them certified. And so one of the thing that was amazing is you just see these different types of service providers, different requirements in their different countries that they serve, and having this standardized technology and getting certified was very, very well received by them. In fact, a number of the service providers received their certification certificates at the meeting. And so I think defining the wholesale access, the e-access services, and the standardized ENNI is really going to drive forward Ethernet ubiquity, just like you can get an E1 or a T1 around, T1 in the U.S. and Canada, E1 in the rest of the world. That's really what we're driving this all towards. We want to make that Ethernet access the new T1 or new E1 for access. And so we're at the early stages of that because it's just being standardized. But I think that's really one of the catalysts for mass market deployment.
Very good summary there. Thank you, gentlemen. And I would just like to remind folks that, again, we'll be covering the wholesale topic at the Ethernet Expo, and Nan Chen from the MEF is going to be giving a keynote on the morning of the second day at the show, so you'll have more of an update across the various MEF initiatives. So thank you all very much for joining us, and have a good day.
I gotta go in the back.